Thank you.
Shamai, thank you very much for having myself and Hammad, and welcome to everyone who has turned up on this evening. And I think it's getting a little bit chilly outside. Hammad, how are you feeling?
Yeah, very well. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
I want to get straight to your fantastic novel, Four Dervishes, which actually took me several readings to kind of, to get the gist of it. And my sister is hugely enjoying it as well. I wanted to ask you about what inspired you to write it.
Yes, so so I think I can say that about 9 or 10 years ago, when I started writing the novel, it started with an image, with a sort of a vision of a person in a cemetery, in a graveyard. A person walking around in a graveyard. That was the image that I had in my mind when I started it, and then other sort of stories followed that image, and what I was sort of trying to get across was a few issues that I had seen from very close growing up in Pakistan, where I was born and grew up. So yeah, it was from that image that I took the basic idea of the novel from.
Okay, I want to get to this concept of the Dastan literature, which the novel belongs to. Would you like to say a little bit about what is Dastan, and also how your novel kind of fits in within that, please?
Yes, certainly. So Dastan is a medieval form of storytelling, oral storytelling, that originated in India, and then from there it migrated to Persia, and from there through Arabia to Europe, in a way. And one of the most famous ones is 1001 Nights, and it's so I experimented with this form. I used it because it's a very handy way to frame a story and then tell multiple stories, have multiple narratives within that frame story. And because I had a few stories that I wanted to to write about, I thought it was a very handy format for that as well. And as I mentioned earlier about this this image of a man in a graveyard, there was a precedent of a similar story from a similar dastan, which was written in the 13th century by an Indo-Persian poet, Amir Khusro, who wrote the tale of Four Dervishes, Qissa Chahar Darwish. And in that dastan, or in that story, there's a king who's going through an existential crisis, and he ventures out one night and goes to this graveyard and sees chances upon four characters who are disguised as dervishes. Dervish being a wandering fakir, wandering monk, you could say, in a way. And there are these four dervishes sitting around fire, and they are telling each other their stories, how they have ended up in that graveyard on that night. So I liked that idea, I borrowed that, and I used that, I put it in, contemporary sort of, a contemporary state between South Asia and Middle East, you could say, a fictional state called Sakia. And so the narrator of my novel, who's also called Khusro, goes out one night because there's a power cut in the city, which was a common occurrence when I was growing up in Pakistan. And he goes to this graveyard. He ends up there, and he meets these four unusual characters who tell each of whom tells a story about how they have ended up in that place that night. So yes, that's Dastan, and that's how it fits in my novel. And also, just going back to how it has inspired European fiction, or the Western canon of fictional narratives. It's very interesting that how it was borrowed by one of the earliest writers of the Western canon, Cervantes, who writes about a fictional character, Sid Himete, or Sayyid Hamid, his name would be in Arabic, who he says is the narrator, the real narrator of his novel Don Quixote. So he was obviously inspired by these oral tales he had heard from Moors, from Arabs, and so he gives that credit, the credit of his story being inspired from that tradition himself.
Fantastic. I wonder if you'd like to read an extract from your novel.
Oh yes, thank you very much. So going back to that idea of oral storytelling, when I was a child, my grandaunt told me bedtime stories of the adventures of her grandfather Ali Verdi, a renowned Noha Khan, or performer of dirges. Born in a well-reputed family of royal jesters, he had his career lined up for him. All he needed was to follow his ancestors' mirthful profession and to make his regal audience laugh with the ages-old gags and jokes with punchlines that never failed to do their trick. But inexplicably, he turned out to be nothing like his ancestors and had a strange partiality to wailing, which defied all kinds of logical or illogical reasoning. It was first discovered one summer, his 8th to be precise, when his uncles and their families were visiting his home before setting off for the famous comedy Fringe. One day, while the grown-ups were all rehearsing their juggling, stand-up, clown routines, he took his cousins to his room, where he entertained them by singing old ballads about candy mountains and unrequited passions that he had lately been listening to on the antediluvian family-sized radio. That afternoon, after having brought the little guests to an utmost tearful state, he showed them proudly to the grown-ups, who were at first merely perplexed. Following a series of similar incidents, however, the painful realization dawned upon his parents that their only son was a pursuant of morose themes, a freak in a family of buffoons. A devout man, his repertoire consisted of threnodies, elegies, and dirges, marsias, nohas, and soos. He composed himself about the Battle of Karbala, in dedication to the family of the third Imam, betrayed by the treacherous Kufids and martyred in the desert, and whose daughters were later imprisoned in dark Damascene dungeons. Soon his fame reached far, and he was invited to perform before His Most Serene Highness, who bestowed upon him the inviolable title of the Worthy of Woe. Despite all the fame and prosperity, he never forgot his busking past, however, and never returned a seeker empty-handed. When once approached by a beggar and not finding on his person any change or bank cards to give him, he took off his embroidered, perfumed shirt and handed it to the astonished mendicant. The first Lord Worthy of Woe had to travel long expanses, galloping astride his faithful mare throughout the 7 climates of the globe. During his travels, he befriended many famous people, had affairs with many starlets of the silver screen, and fought duels with forces of darkness. My favorite tale of all his adventures was the one about his visit to the Holy See. My grandaunt used to emphasize here how this particular journey had been ominous from the beginning. Ali Verdi was passing through a dense, sunless jungle when he lost his way and stumbled upon a village with rather peculiar inhabitants. The villagers, in strange garish and gaudy garments, took him to the chief of the tribe. This hoary, in-turbaned man congratulated my surprised forefather on his fame, which had obviously reached their little village. Then he eagerly expressed his wish to hear the famous account of the bravery of Abbas, peace be upon him, and his progeny, the brother and loyal flag-bearer of the third Imam, peace be upon him, and his progeny, who had fought valiantly without arms in order to quench the thirst of his young niece in the scorching heat and the desert plain of Karbala. At this point, my grand-aunt would recite and declaim the entire Marsiya, assuming a solemn tone, calling to mind battle drums and hoofs, arching her eyebrows on each guttural letter. The doleful tale of the valiant but caring uncle attempting to fill his water skin from the Euphrates, but getting his arms chopped off instead by the enemies, brought an oxus to the chief's eyes, and those present could not help but break into a full-blown ceremony of mourning and wailing. After the wailing affair, Ali Verdi was duly treated to a hearty banquet in his honor, with villagers bringing him a massive heap of the most scrumptious gosfand pulao and shami kebabs he'd ever tasted in his life. The more he ate from the heap and filled his stomach from this manna, the more it grew in quantity. After having savored this delicious delight for hours, Ali Verdi Khan reluctantly decided to leave his meal to resume it in the morning. He went to sleep in the tent of the chief, and lo and behold, as my grand-aunt would say in her attempt to surprise her attentive listener with the grand finale, when he woke up in the morning, he found himself lying under a solitary date palm in an infinite sandy plain. There were no tents or villages in sight. In fact, the whole village had disappeared. There were vultures circling above his head, and the plate lying beside him was filled with a heap of dry cow dung, witnessing which it slowly dawned upon our perplexed dirge singer that he had been a guest of no less than the chief of jinns himself. Having enjoyed the reputed hospitality of these fiery creatures, for it is a known fact that jinns can only eat waste and excrement, and cannot digest food which has not been previously processed through an animal's guts and expelled through its cavities. This, Thank you.
I can only smell the food.
Hopefully before it was it gained its later form. But yeah, thank you very much for asking me to read, and I would like to return the favor by asking you to read one of your poems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the poem I'm going to be reading is sort of connected to food because it's Ramadan. It's called Ramadan, and it's a poem about sort of the effect, the hallucinogenic effect of. Oops, I'm sorry. Thank you, Gordon. The effect of not eating, during the process of Ramadan, which is sort of basically from from sort of before sunrise to sunset. And this poem has been published in the Bad Lilies magazine. The hours play out each shadow. Bluebells, wild garlic, the flowering quince spread each inch of the morning. I measure their 360 turns, elongating, shortening, drowning the first hint of bumblebees. The clock wasps, amaral lashes, keep tab on the lengthening minutes of the sun. I serenade each fly, landing on thighs, wanting to be exposed. I want to subjugate restless souls by lying still. Splash savage wings in lacrimae, murmuring non-violence, incanting the whole lunar month. This whole April, my merciful axe is a blade sheathed in bacchanal. Daddy Longlegs, still forming, fit snug inside my half glass, lent out to the wind. At the vertex of sun, I dream up a tramontane, a gust to figwort my glands, quench each parch. The day done, at sunset, I'm mad, certified. I've relived all the berries crushed. And in Kincaid Street, the calla lily in the garden front, looking up to the last of the crimson, its spadix, thirsting, a yellow pine for the sky, drifting from the milky spade, wanting to hold on. I walk past unacknowledged. I'm on a mission to calm the guttural Bay of Bengal. The first droplet is a lightning rod flute to temper each sand grain, fit for a palm to dip. Imprint a dusky Maghrib azan. The day then begins all over again. Thank you.
The radio mic, 2 radio mics.
Oh. Okay, Hammad. So I want to return to this Dastan literature again and its spread, because you've already talked about Don Quixote and Cervantes. So I wanted to, in my research of sort of Dastan literature, I discovered one of your ancestors from the 14th century, a renowned historian who passed away in 1318 AD, and his name was Rashid al-Din Hamadani. Rest his soul in peace. He was talking about one of the Azerbaijani Dastans, a character whom I don't quite know if this is the correct pronunciation. It's Dide Korkut, and Dada Garud is sort of the name of the character within a film version made sort of in the 1970s of a grandfather who lives for 295 years. And I kind of wanted to talk to you or ask you about the spread of this sort of this Dastan literature.
Yeah, very interesting. Dede Korkut, I mean Dede in that means grandfather in various Turkic languages, including Azerbaijani. And as I mentioned earlier, that there are various traditions of oral storytelling. Obviously, in Europe, for example, there's the cycle of Norse mythologies and sagas, and then you also have Greek mythologies. Obviously, the form that I have grown up reading or listening to is Dastan from Persia and India, obviously. But as I said, it also spread from Persia via the Arabs to Europe. And in another way, also another famous medieval or Renaissance cycle of stories, Boccaccio's Decamerone, has also inspiration from, takes inspiration from Dastan, because there are a couple of stories set in the Arab world, the Muslim world, you could say. So yeah, it's interesting how it spread all over these places. And Dede Korkut is also a medieval or ancient Turkic Dastan. Is also interesting because I think you mentioned earlier when we were talking about it how there were various versions of that going around during the Soviet era, and how they sort of propagated various versions in the various Turkic speaking lands. I don't know if you would like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, from what I have read, that when the sort of the Bolshevik Soviets started to expand Russia territorially, they came into contact with the present-day Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, and all of those Central Asian Sufi Muslim regions, which at one time might have been part of the Iranian Empire. And one way of suppressing culture is to play with its literature. And from what I have read, it's the Soviet authorities basically twisted the Dastan by introducing different versions of these tales. And this didn't really sort of just find itself within the sort of the Muslims of Dastan, but it also found in versions of the Kiev and Rus, the present-day Ukrainian sort of region, where we have kind of, I guess, Russian fairy tales for characters like Alyosha Popovich and Nikita Kozumaka. I'm not quite sure if the pronunciation is correct, but these are always sort of heroes, local heroes or peasants who rise up to defeat an oppressor. But so within the context of the suppression, if in the days before internet or television, even radio, if you suppress these oral traditions, then certainly the next generation will be growing up with a new version of the tale.
That's very interesting. And also a little point about the hero you mentioned, the peasant hero, who's called Bogatir in the Slavic in the Slavic tradition. The word is also interesting and tells you about the spread of this genre, this storytelling as well, because the word itself comes from Turkic Mongol Bahadur or Bagatur, but the capital of Mongolia, for example, Ulaanbaatar. The word Batur in that is also hero, is the same word. So how from Mongolia to India, because Bahadur is quite a common name, it was the name of the last emperor, the Mughal emperor before the British, Bahadur Shah Zafar. Yeah.
He was a poet.
He was also a poet, yeah, Bahadur Shah Zafar. Very good poet of Urdu and Punjabi and some other languages as well. So yeah, Bahadur, how this word has spread also tells you a little bit about the spread of this form of storytelling as well. It's fascinating in that way as well. Yeah.
I want to come back to magic realism, which I think for Western audiences, I think there's aspects of magic realism within your novel. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yes, definitely. So some of the writers I really admired when whom I read growing up, for example, in the Western tradition, Italo Calvino, Borges, Rushdie, and Günter Grass, for example, they all write in this, using this technique, you could say, a form or genre, magic realism. But in another way, it's not an alien sort of a thing for Dastan itself, because Dastans are full of magical settings. They've got fairies and jinns and all that, which I have tried to incorporate. The difference being that you have a sort of a realistic rather than fantastical setting, more sort of relatable to the audience, and then you have some magical, some supernatural element into that. But yeah, so I had inspiration from both, this sort of Western literature that I was reading, but also the literature that I grew up listening to from my grandfather's tales, for example, or the books that I read when I was a child.
Would you like to read a minute, perhaps?
Sure. Thank you. So this chapter is called Mrs. Kennedy and the Camel Man. And this is the first narrator. So there are four narrators, as I mentioned, Four Dervishes, and this one is Layla. I recall that night vividly, Layla continued. Amma had woken up in the middle of the night, screaming her head off. I rushed to her bedroom to find Baba scolding, threatening, and shaking her frantically, but she wouldn't stop screaming. When she had screamed for a good half an hour or so, he seemed to remember an ancient trick. He brought Amma's slippers near her nose, and the magical smell brought her back to her senses. This is an old sort of a trick that works apparently. After a brief pause, she said, "Someone just came to my bed. I couldn't see her face because she was wearing a cloak. She put her hand here." She pointed to her stomach. "She took my pancreas out of my body, hid it somewhere in this room, and went away. I could not stir or do anything to stop her because I was scared to death." Baba thought it was an absolutely preposterous idea and told her to come to her senses. "Your pancreas is not located where you're pointing at," he said. But Amma was adamant. "She took my pancreas away, but it's still somewhere here, right in this room," she kept repeating in a hysteric way. Finally, Baba gave in. He called the maids and asked them to look under the carpets and in the chests that had not been opened in ages. Of course, there was nothing out of the ordinary there. He told Amma to go to sleep. "No, I cannot sleep," she whined. "I want to eat something sweet. Bring me some halwa." And that was the beginning of her obsession with puddings and sweetmeats. She would gather heaps of sweets and puddings from across the world around her every morning, and while some village maidens would be fanning her in the courtyard, she would be wolfing down various sweetmeats: Multani Sohan, Dehlvi Kalakand, Khushabi Dhoda, Shahpuri Patisa, Gaziantep Baklava, Bengali Roshogulla, Yorkshire Parkin, Isfahani Gaz, Occitan Nougat, Florida key lime pie, Mesopotamian Karasukia, Manila halo halo, eaten mass throughout the day. She seemed to have no control over it. When Baba hid her sweets sometimes, out of annoyance, she would go out in the sugarcane fields and would suck the sap out of the ripe canes. Now, as you can imagine, gradually this sugary gluttony had resulted in her blood turning abnormally sweet, so sweet that she became a favorite of all kinds of blood-sucking vermin and parasites. Mosquitoes, fleas, bed bugs, midges, you name it. One morning she woke up with an excessively itchy head, and the more she scratched it, the more unbearable it became. She realized with horror that her head had been infested with a large colony of lice. Pediculus humanus capitis. This narrator is obsessed with scientific names of species. She ran to the bathroom and washed it with oils, soaps and shampoos, but the stubborn lice would not leave her. She told Baba about it, who told her off. "I saw it coming. Your blood has turned sweet. What do you want me to do now?" Nevertheless, he gave her an amulet to hang around her neck, but that was just as futile. Meanwhile, the itch had become agonizing. Amma had no choice now. She had to get the insects exterminated one by one. She sat down in front of the mirror and tried to get hold of the bloodsuckers in her head, but soon realized how difficult it was to find the agile vampires. So far, she had been too proud to let her maids know that she, like a homeless urchin, was providing food and shelter to insects, but seeing that she herself was totally helpless before the vermin, she had to think of other options. An alternative was to get her head shaven, but that would have caused a lot of rumors and a great deal of embarrassment. Nevertheless, when she finally swallowed her pride and appointed her maids to the task, the wretched lice proved equally elusive for them. They would dodge their chasing fingers easily. That's when Zara's mother, Asala, brought her daughter to our courtyard. "Your Excellency, my little one has an extremely sharp pair of eyes," Asala said proudly. "She is very good with lice, and every time the darned crawlers visit my head, she gets rid of them for me." Amma looked at the puny child in disbelief, but seeing no other option, squatted down helplessly with her back towards Zara, the delouser, who sat above my mother's head to have a better look over it, and in this temporary higher position found lice in the dark folds of my mother's hair, caught the fleeing thief, placed it on the nail of her left thumb, using its right counterpart to crush it. Amma's head was clean in a couple of hours. This is how you do it, like this.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I keep forgetting how funny this novel is.
I've got this very annoying cough, sorry.
I wanted to talk about aspects of sort of the regional dialects. Your novel is so rich in so many different languages. Now, I know that you speak 9 languages, and I think learning a 10th. I wondered if you would like to sort of talk about a little bit about the regional languages, but also elements of Dastan. Is it sort of is it just male heroes and tales of men, heroic men, or are women? Do we have any women commentators? Do we have any women characters?
Right. Yes. So, to answer the first question about regional languages and using other languages and scripts, because that was one of the things that I experimented with in a way. So it's Four Dervishes has a few scripts. It uses a few scripts like Arabic for writing, Urdu, or some of my regional languages, Seraiki, Shahpuri, for example, and there's also Greek, for example. Depending on the character, I wanted to experiment with it, but also I wanted to write something which I thought was authentic, because my characters are from that region, and I wanted to give them their own language, their own voice. So it's all that. To answer your second question about female characters in Dastan, so for example in Four Dervishes, all the 4 dervishes are male. They're male characters. But one of the most famous Dastans that I already mentioned, the 1001 Nights, that's famously that the narrator of that Dastan, Shahrazad, she's not only telling the story, although on the surface she's trying to avoid the destiny that her predecessors have met, trying to avoid being killed by this person who's listening to the story. But she's also controlling the narrative through that. She's controlling so it's very subversive in that sort of way. She's controlling the narrative, she's controlling her own destiny, and she manages to escape that fate in the end. And so that's a very good example of a, you could say, of a feminist sort of a narrative in a medieval Dastan. And there are other characters like that as well. Dunyazad, for example, her sister is also she also appears in the same cycle of stories, but predominantly you could say that it's a story about it's a form of stories about male characters, which I didn't want to repeat in my Dastan. So the first narrator is a female character, and then there are stories about other female protagonists in Four Dervishes.
Thank you. I sort of wondered what are you up to now? What are you working on? Is there another book?
Yes, I've been working on my second novel, and it's more sort of grounded in reality. It doesn't have a sort of magical sort of a aspect or element.
Are we allowed to ask when this is set in?
Yes. So I've taken some inspiration from my own background, my own childhood, and it's set in Pakistan, right after the regime of a military dictator called General Zia-ul-Haq, who died in 1988, and he and he left a legacy of a very sort of conservative state behind him. He came from a very traditional conservative sort of a background himself, and and a lot of the times when we look at the issues Pakistan is having today, his name is evoked quite often. He's quite often mentioned, like, oh, it's his legacy. So I want to write about his legacy, but from the point of view of a family and their personal tragedies in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s in Pakistan, in the region where I come from. So it's about that. It's also about grief, which is a very essential part of a minority in Pakistan, Shia minority, who mourn the death of the third Imam that I have already mentioned in this book, and it's also about personal grief as well. So I'm trying to explore all these different themes in this in the upcoming novel.
Fascinating.
And what about yourself? What are you working on?
So I have my first collections manuscript to be handed in by the end of July,
Right.
and there is a long-term project also beyond that, which is I've been trying to kind of write a philosophical response to T.S. Eliot's sort of last long poem, Four Quartets, which talks a lot about Indian religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, the idea of dualism. So this is an ongoing project. It's sort of still formulating, but that's kind of beyond my first collection. I think I'm going to be looking at that.
That's fascinating. I do some, as Priti mentioned earlier, I do some classes on Urdu literature, and we recently read a very famous Urdu novel from the 50s, Aag Ka Darya, The River of Fire, by Qurratul Ain Haider, an Urdu writer. And in the beginning of that novel, she has translated a part of an excerpt from I think it's the third part of the Four Quartets,
Right.
which is about the river. The river is
Yes, a brown god.
a brown god, and she's Darya ek Matiyala Devta hai. She translates it like that. Gusse se bhara, it's full of anger or something like that.
We must have a conversation about that at some point. But